Coming to you live from a cabin deep in the heart of the Canadian wilderness. Turn down the lights, get yourself a drink, and let's settle in for tonight's broadcast.
Hello guys and ghouls, welcome back to Midnight Mysteries Radio for another episode of Things That Go Bump in the Night. Tonight we're talking about ley lines, portals, and mystical places. I'm really excited for this talk, guys. A lot of you were looking forward to it, received a lot of feedback that this is something you wanted to hear about. Remember, as always, Things That Go Bump in the Night is an opportunity to interact with your hosts. I'll be going over content followed by a time of back and forth with the audience. So, what are ley lines? I like the way the Fairlax Dictionary puts it. One of various supposed alignments of ancient monuments and prehistoric sites in straight lines, believed by some to indicate paths of positive energy inherent in the earth. Boiled down, ley lines are a series of interweaving lines that span the globe. The lines are latitudinal, longitudinal, and they seem to intersect and align with significant historical monuments, ruins, temples, mountains, and other places of significance and megalithic importance. Furthermore, there's the belief that these lines also coincide with supernatural, paranormal, and metaphysical occurrences, which I intend on going through here tonight with you. So, where did the theory come from? Well, the phrase ley lines originated with the author, an award-winning inventor, antiquarian, and archaeologist Alfred Watkins. Alfred Watkins was born in 1855 in England. In 1921, while driving the English countryside to possibly test out some of his new photographic inventions, and this detail wasn't quite clear in my research, he consulted a map and noticed that there was a system of straight lines crossing the landscape between different ruins and historical monuments and again, places of significance throughout the English history. He continued to study these lines, and later in 1921, he began approaching various academic institutions and presenting a paper entitled Early British Trackways, Moats, Mounds, Camps, and Sites. In this research paper, he introduced a new concept, the ley line. He believed that there was a series of man-made lines that connected ancient religious monuments with architecture, sacred places, mountains, valleys, and ruins for the purpose of trading routes and ritualistic practices. He noticed that these lines didn't just connect places from a few hundred years ago, but they spanned ancient megalithic sites from thousands of years ago, during the Neolithic Age and beyond. He ended up obsessing over this theory for the rest of his life and went around and shared his research, his findings, and evidence with others. A lot of critics responded, and most academics did not accept his work at first. They said that there were, so many ancient sites that they're likely to line up with each other in some way, which is true. But Watkins responded by showing the evidence that these ancient religious and historical monuments could be given precise values between being a quarter point and 1 point of each other. And what's interesting to note is that if you take these lines that connect these megalithic sites from around England and the rest of Europe, and you extend them across the world, they continue to line up with other cultures' ancient religious and historical sites, within the same precision that we just mentioned, the same precision of a quarter point to 1 point of each other. We'll dive into that point more in just a minute here. Now, Watkins did not believe that there was any sort of supernatural, paranormal, or metaphysical properties to these lines. I thought John Bruno Hare, curator of the Internet Sacred Texts Archive, or the ISTA, an organization that provides a free archive of electronic texts about religion, mythology, legends, and folklore, and occult and esoteric topics, sums up Watkins' views perfectly. Bruno said, Watkins never attributed any supernatural significance to leys. He believed that they were simply pathways that could be used for trade or ceremonial purposes. Very ancient in origin, possibly dating back to the Neolithic, certainly pre-Roman days. He was an intensely rational person with an active intellect. Seeing some of you guys jump on. Excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for dedicating part of your evening to this podcast. So, are ley lines simply a geographical and topographical grid connecting ancient sites? Or is there more to them than that? Are there other academics, organizations, movements of people groups that not only noticed the ley lines or these significant places, but also noticed unexplainable phenomena alongside them? Let's start with examples of people from within some of our listeners' lifetime and then work our way backwards. Now, we've seen a lot of news and disclosure about UFOs in the past 3 years. A lot. From reports in Congress to VIP quotations to mass sightings, NASA astronaut experiences, and more. I'm not going to go over evidence for UFOs in this episode. Mike and I, my other host, as part of our main podcast, have already covered that. And you could check out that episode on Spotify, YouTube, or any other platform we're on. Instead, these instances of UFOs are going to be reported as eyewitness encounters in relation to ley lines. One of the repeating patterns we see with UFO sightings, evidence, and experiences is they travel in straight lines. In the vast majority of reports received in the MUFON CMS, or the case management system, these unknown objects float, accelerate, and deaccelerate in straight lines. When they need to turn, they move in physics-defying arcs. Such arcing at 90 degrees while going hundreds of kilometers an hour, such as we saw with the mass UFO sightings over the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in 1952, and in other instances like the Navy UFO disclosure footage. In 1997, a retired military and commercial airline pilot, Bruce L. Cathley, published a book called The Energy Grid. In it, he details his experiences observing UFOs during his time working for the New Zealand military. Bruce Cathley noted that these crafts were always following straight lines. In 2010, New Zealand Defense released hundreds of UFO files for the public to read, which corroborated Bruce Cathley's sightings and many other New Zealand's pilot sightings. After mapping them, Bruce Cathley discovered that they also followed a distinctive grid pattern. Additionally, while flying over some of the zones, he also noticed that various structures were actively being built along the UFO paths, along these grid paths, including military bases, and we'll bounce back to that in just a minute here. In the 1960s, an ex-RAF pilot, or the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force pilot, Tony Wedd, publicly came forward about his and fellow servicemen's sightings regarding UFOs and how they all line up with this invisible grid that he had trouble articulating. But again, a different military member from a different country observing UFOs and observing the patterns of them over grids. And remember, these are trained pilots. These guys encounter balloons, they encounter enemy aircraft, they encounter strange weather phenomena, and yet they said these things they're encountering are UFOs. Again, not an episode of UFOs, but I tend to trust people who are trained in their realm of influence. In 1958, Ami Michel, a famous French psychologist and philosopher, published a book entitled, in English, Mysterious Celestial Objects. This book covered a mysterious wave of UFO sightings that occurred in France by both mass groups of people and independents. With the help from Jacques Bergier, who is, interestingly enough, a chemical engineer, a member of the French Resistance, a spy, journalist, and writer, they developed a theory called orthod... My screen's flickering. Sorry, guys. The connection at the cabin is iffy sometimes. Orthodony in English. So they developed a theory called orthodony in English. They postulated so-called alignments or straight lines that corresponded to different areas on Earth. McCall claimed that UFO sightings could be clustered along these grid lines. He proposed, for example, that ancient megalithic and religious sites also coincided with UFO sightings. Views like this went on to inspire authors, intellectuals, and inventors like John Mitchell, Richard Long, Lane St. Clair, his early poetry, Dr. Stephen Greer, Zachary Sitchin, and more. In 1920, a German evangelical parson named Wilhelm Dieu proposed a similar theory he called Heile. This is German. I'm going to butcher this for all of our German speakers, but Heilige Lien, or Holy Lines. And I'm going to refer to it as Holy Lines from here on out because I will not be able to come remotely close to pronouncing that. So Wilhelm Dieu proposed a similar theory he called Holy Lines that linked a number of standing stones, churches, crosses, and other objects of spiritual significance in Germany. And when we look closer to Germany during that time period, there was a whole government expressing a belief in ley lines. These spots are so well known for paranormal activity that the Nazis ended up building an entire system around it. They tried to map through ancient geographical sites such as Stonehenge, the Egyptian pyramids, Mesoamerican pyramids, and more. And Hitler was so obsessed with the occult that he tried to place military bases, which is what we're flashing on from earlier, onto these ley lines. And folks, this isn't a conspiracy theory. I know we've seen the Nazis' obsession with the occult on things like Raiders of the Lost Ark, but if you check out a book called, if you check out the book published by Yale University called Hitler's Monsters by Eric Kurlander, a professor of history at Stetson University, he goes over the historical and documented portion of Hitler's and the Nazi and the SS's obsession with the occult. From werewolves and sirens to dark forces and possession, Hitler's SS and Nazi soldiers believed that there was something supernatural behind their movement. We could spend an entire episode on the Nazis' obsession with the occult, experimental experiences with UFOs and more, but we're limited for time, so we're going to carry on. Ley lines fall across the Native American Indian trails in the Sierra regions of California. There's the Bolivian lines, the Reformed Christian shrines and churches, the tracks of the Anasazi in New Mexico, the Mayan White Road temples, and every one of the Mesoamerican pyramids, England's Stonehenge, Egypt's Great Pyramids, Peru's Machu Picchu ruins, Australia's Ayers Rock, and more. We also have one of the world's largest intersection of ley lines here in our very own Alberta, Canada, right near Buffalo Lake. The intersections also fall through supposed haunted forests, sacred wells, Golgotha Hill, where Jesus died, and more. I'm going to paste our link into another page because the page has asked me specifically to share it with them. One moment here. Okay. Yeah, people are joining. Awesome. Excited for us to continue. Again, For those of you who are in Alberta, and I've hinted at this in plenty of podcasts past with other groups, we have one of the world's largest intersection of ley lines right here near Buffalo Lake. These intersections, just to reiterate really quick, they also fall through, supposed haunted forest, sacred wells, Golgotha Hill, again, where Jesus died, and so forth. Not going to lie, when I was writing and researching this script, I felt so overwhelmed because I didn't know where to start. A little disclaimer, we could spend an entire season of Midnight Mysteries talking about things like ancient places and sacred geometry. I believe the universe was intentionally and fine-tunedly designed. We see mathematics like the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, and logarithmic. Guys, my screen's flickering again. Okay. We see mathematics like the Fibonacci sequence, golden ratio, logarithmic spiral in human engineering, but we also see the same numeric patterns as the flowers in the fields below and the galaxies and cosmos in the sky above. And I love the whole topic of sacred geometry and biblical numerology. It's where I see the creative handiwork of the master architect throughout the universe the clearest. But we only have so much time for tonight. So instead, I'm going to briefly touch on how some of these ancient places are simply more than ancient ruins, and instead were designed and intended for something much deeper than everyday use. In fact, countercultural back then was to suggest that they were totally nominal. If you went to any of the priests or priestesses or rulers of the time and said, listen up, these pyramids, they're just totally nominal structures. I don't know why people are making a big deal out of it. You may have been killed for that belief. So I'm going to use pyramids from across the world as an example, but instances and similarities can also be applied to all of the other sites listed above. There are thousands of pyramids across the world, guys. There are more than 100 in Egypt, double that in Sudan, and dozens in the Middle East and China. And then the Americas have more pyramids than the rest of the world combined. Again, the Americas have more pyramids than the rest of the world combined. That's mind-blowing, because I think when we all talk about, pyramids, we think of, ancient Egypt, wherein there's, just over 100, but the majority of them aren't in Egypt. And we're still discovering these pyramids. In 2017, National Geographic reported that the largest Mayan pyramid had just been discovered from a LiDAR survey. That's only 6 years ago. 6 years ago. And it's astonishing to believe that across continents, across the world, these independent and unconnected cultures, over thousands of years, all built the same shape structure. But not only were the structures the same shape, in the shape of a pyramid, but these people groups believed that the pyramids were gateways for gods to interact with them, to meet with them, and a place to sacrifice to them. Additionally, these pyramids line up with astronomical movements across the sky, such as constellations and stars. According to John Sergis, author of Gate of the Gods, Graham Hancock, author of Fingerprints of the Gods, Andrew Collins, author of Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, there's Gateway of the Gods, Craig Hines, and countless other historians. All these cultures believed, and I quote, humans of the past went through these gates to meet their gods. By going through the door, they gained immortality and a life next to the gods. The stories also mention that a few of those humans returned to Earth through these gates with their gods. The gate was a gateway to the land of the gods. The concept of a stargate or a portal, a gate where someone can travel to different places, is prominent in other legends as well, such as those of the Sumerians. And a lot of you are familiar with Zachary Sitchin and his Planet X or Nibiru legends. Whether you agree with his predictions or insights or not, you have to admit he really, really popularized the learning of ancient Sumeria. So these people groups not only intentionally built the pyramids, where they were to line up with different astronomical bodies and cosmic circumstances, but they built them with the belief in mind that they were mystical places, places of great importance, places where Earth could be a gate for the beyond. So, we've looked at who coined the term ley lines. We looked at how ley lines don't seem to be purely coincidental designations or just simply physical links, but they also seem to have paranormal associations too. We looked at why cultures viewed some of these places as majestic, specifically with the pyramids and why they line up with stars, but also tout to be gateways to the gods. But are there any external indicators that ley lines could exist? Indicators that aren't here on Earth. One recent astronomical event we can look at and gather information from is the 2017 solar eclipse. And I teased about this eclipse in the episode trailer. Now, are all eclipses supernatural or paranormal? In my opinion, no. Are all astronomical events supernatural? No. So how can we sort through the ones that are and the ones that aren't? I think it's up to us to gather a base of evidence and let the investigation tell its own story. You know, I love full moons. We did an episode on lunacy and lycanthropy. There's a lot of lore, a lot of mythology. There's stats and data to back up, higher rates of crime during full moons, but we still need to let the evidence tell its own story and not to put our subjective opinions into it. So, some different backgrounds on types of eclipses before we get started. There are 4 different types of solar eclipses, namely the partial eclipse, annular eclipse, and total eclipse. But then, on August 21st, 2017, a total eclipse traversed the United States of America. The eclipse path went through Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina. While eclipses are not that uncommon, total solar eclipses only occur about every year and a half and often occur over the ocean rather than land. It has been since that eclipse in 2017, it had been 99 years since a total solar eclipse appeared over top of the majority of states. But the last total eclipse like this over the USA took place in August 1776, 1 week after the Declaration of Independence was completely signed. And this eclipse also followed major ley lines. Now, we live in a golden age of information as podcasters, as researchers. When it comes to things like the moon, eclipses, and so forth, the internet is a gold mine filled with historical records, mathematical predictors, and archived records. The calculations for solar eclipses, past and present, are so precise that they can calculate the occurrence of an eclipse down to the second. And side note, as I was researching the different types of and durations of eclipses, I came across the occult name of the new moon that caused the solar eclipse that 2017. It was called a dark moon or black moon, which is named after Lilith. Lilith is a Sumerian or Babylonian demon goddess who is perhaps better known for her role in Jewish legend. Called the Dark Maid or Maiden of Desolation, Lilith is associated with owls and is a creature of the night. This demoness is also highly revered in the occult community. So this started connecting some pieces for me because there's been a huge resurgence in occultic practices across North America. And there's a huge focus for the majority of these groups that was on the 2017 solar eclipse. So I knew I had to start looking at geographical locations that this eclipse was going to go over, given its significance to so many people and different religious and mystical and esoteric groups. When I hopped on Google Earth, I discovered that Google Earth has a pre-built eclipse plugin. I was able to map every eclipse from the past 100 years and for the next 100 years. Sure enough, I found one mystically revered place that repeatedly kept showing up in the eclipse path. The eclipse started in Salem, Oregon, then continued to Salem, Idaho, and then Salem, Wyoming, then Salem, Nebraska, then Salem, Missouri, then Salem, Kentucky, and then ended with Salem, South Carolina. At this point, I was pretty sure that I was onto something. Not only did it follow major ley lines, but it crossed over 7 different Salems. And if you're paying attention, we've had a lot of reoccurring number 7s, which is a whole other subject. So I'd wondered if other people had noticed this significance too, the fact that it crossed over 7 different Salems in the States. So I began to call various hotels in the different towns and cities and discovered that every single one of them had been booked for that eclipse in 2017. So the next geographical significance I found was that the eclipse followed a fault line in the States called the Mid-Continental Rift System, or the MCRS. It's a giant fault line that's been lying dormant under more than half the states, and it also follows some of the largest trivertices of ley lines. Now, this next part blew my mind. While I was researching fault lines, I found that the New Madrid fault line intersected with the MCRS. So then I looked up when the next total eclipse will be, and let me pause on that. So the New Madrid fault line is the other major fault line in the States, and it crosses, it crosses the states like this. And so the first eclipse that happened in 2017 followed the MCRS, and sure enough, the next eclipse is 7 years after 2017, or next year, follows the other fault line, the New Madrid fault line. So not only do these fault lines create an X over top of the states, but this eclipse follows both those lines, and both those lines follow ley lines. So this is unprecedented. The total solar eclipse this past year in 2017 was a once in a lifetime opportunity. Something that only occurs every few hundred years, but with the very same conditions. There's another one 7 years after, which is next year. You can't make this up, but I wasn't done. I felt like there was more to the story. So then I wanted to see, like many of the other UFO waves we've gone over tonight, if there was a correlation, a connection between UFO sightings and the path of the eclipse. So I started pouring through UFO reports leading up to the eclipse. I had to sort through the various classifications from MUFON and see which ones were genuine UFO encounters. So MUFON, when we receive reports, the investigators will go and try and they'll try and prove what it is. They're not trying to prove it's UFO. They're trying to figure out if it's a plane in the sky, if it's, a planet, if it's some weird atmospheric conditions, drones. And then once they've gone through everything, then they go, it's labeled a UFO. And they don't try and push their beliefs onto people what UFOs might be. They just leave it at that, which I really appreciate. But most of my research just looked like pages and pages of data. So I went onto Google Earth and began plugging in the various sightings and locations. And I ended up with a group of UFOs converging on the convergence of these 2 eclipses. So a group of UFOs over the X, which are over the major fault lines, which are over the ley lines, sitting there. And so, like these other researchers we've gone through tonight, these famous researchers and academics and intellectuals, we can see that these UFOs do coincide with ley lines, and that astronomical circumstances seem to line up with ley lines as well. And this, I studied over 200 UFO cases, and the data led to the UFOs converging over the cross of those eclipse past, which is just mind-blowing. Yeah, that's it for the official portion of the evening. I'm looking forward to chatting with some of you now. There's so much for us as speakers, as podcasters, as when I went through my Toastmasters class. It is so much more difficult to come up with a short episode than it is a longer episode, because with longer episodes, you can take your time unpacking everything, but you're not necessarily going to retain the audience's attention. So, yeah, this is where we're at right now. Dave Wilson said that convergence being local as well as so large is a massive bonus for a story I'm working on. I'm curious about more ideas on what these convergences could potentially mean and what they might be capable of. Dave, for me personally, I believe in something called the unified field theory, which is the belief that all the paranormal is connected, that everything we see and experience within it is connected in some way or another, whether it's dimensional or interdimensional, whether it's Sasquatch or aliens. I believe that it's all part of this universe, like I mentioned, is wonderfully and fearfully made, fine-tunedly made. Brianna says, this was so interesting. Oh, thank you. I'm looking forward to next year's eclipse and what that brings. I am going to plan on doing, I haven't brought this up with Mike yet, but I'm going to plan on doing hopefully some major focus on it before it happens, where we can dive into this research a bit more. Hello, Sandra. Nice to see you. It's been a while. Thanks for saying hi. Yeah, Z says Buffalo Lake road trip. I look at Edmonton here as well, and looking at the Métis and other First Nations groups, there was always something, mystical that drew them to this part of the river valley. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have the largest urban area forest in North America, which is the river valley. And I think there's, a lot of mystical and spiritual things about nature that we miss out on. Wayne says, were there pyramids found in Canada? Not that I know of. Again, the majority of them are found in the Americas, South America, Central America, which again shocks me. I'm going to have a hard time wrapping my mind around that it's not Egypt or the Sudan that have the majority of pyramids. It's like the vast majority of them are, within a much closer traveling distance for many of us. And it wouldn't surprise me, Wayne, if we end up finding pyramids under ice in the future, whether it's Greenland or Antarctica, etc. I think some movies have even hinted at that possibility, and I don't think it's far off. I think humanity is much older than we like to acknowledge. Marie says, get together on that evening for the eclipse. Love that idea. Yeah, love that idea. I've got a telescope. It might be during the day, though, actually, now that I think about it, because it's a solar eclipse or lunar eclipse. Yeah. Dave says, most of what I've heard of ley lines is that they are a source of power, but I'm imagining that a big one like ours could be an anchor point for an interdimensional portal. Sounds like maybe I'm not alone in that thinking as I thought. Dave, I completely agree. I think that, I used pyramids as a case study because there's so many of them. And just, again, guys, I know I'm kind of ranting about this. It blows my mind that these unconnected, independent cultures from across the world that didn't know about each other all built the same shape. But not only did they build the same shape, they all thought it was a gateway to their gods and goddesses, a place for them to meet them here on Earth. And it's freaky when you dive into it a bit more. But in terms of power, I saw that come up a lot in reading for this episode, especially with UFOs. And there's the belief that maybe UFOs are being powered off ley lines. I don't know if I lean towards that theory as much. or at least solely powered from them. Yeah. Wayne says, I think there's a lot under the ice and glaciers that we don't want to know. Certain ignorance is bliss. Yeah, Wayne, I've been reading through Chariots of the Gods recently, and I didn't make notes for this, so excuse me if I butcher these quotations, but Graham Hancock goes over these old maps of, I want to believe it's Antarctica. Anyways, it's some sort of area covered by ice that's uninhabited by humanity, and it's a map of the coastline, but it's covered in ice, right? And there's the belief that it's been covered in ice for as long as before humanity has been around. But when they did an X-ray of this area, whether it's Antarctica or somewhere else, the X-ray showed the outline of this land, and it matched these maps from thousands and thousands of years ago. I wish I'd brought my book home, because then I could just flip to the page. But check it out in Chariots of the Gods, or sorry, not Chariots of the Gods, Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock. It's one of the first few pages. Just blows my mind that it could be so accurate, and these maps could be from thousands of years ago. And you know, some of these like Mayan and Mesoamerican, these Mesoamerican pyramids weren't discovered until like the 1900s, until the 20th century. Like, guys, that's not that long ago. I think the first, I could be off, but I think the first South American pyramids were actually discovered in the early 1900s, which means that we had no idea they existed until then. And again, the fact that we just discovered the largest one in 2017 and didn't know it existed because it's in the dense wilderness is further evidence that we don't know what we don't know. Let's see. Okay, guys, I think I'm going to come close to wrapping it up. Thank you so much for the participation. Linda Dobson, good evening. Marie, hello. Carol, hi. Thank you to everyone for joining us. If you enjoy these episodes, I'm going to be doing them once a month, and Mike and I are going to try and do episodes once a month too. We have a Sasquatch researcher for our episode at the end of March coming up here, which we're really, really excited about. Yeah, more on that later, but thanks for joining me. I think that's the end of our talk for tonight, and we'll see you next time on Things That Go Bump in the Night. Have a good evening.